Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about breaking the sex cycle. Or more specifically, we're going to pose a very provocative question. Is the sexual liberation of women, or the emancipation of female sexuality, the destroyer of civilization? As most of you know, I travel quite a bit. I've spent time in major metropolitan cities across the world. And one of the things that I notice, and a subject I've talked about at length on this channel, is the feminization of our culture, of our civilization, not just of the West, but I think of humanity in general as it stands today. And of course, I have argued vociferously from the inception of this YouTube channel that we are on the cusp of fairly spectacular change. We are transitioning away from the age of prosperity, which is an age of the feminine, and we're moving into an age of scarcity, which is an age of the masculine. But one wonders exactly how that transition occurs, and moreover, what is it that set this age of prosperity in motion? No doubt there are many factors at play, and we've talked about a number of them on this channel. But there's one prevailing factor that is very compelling, and it's gaining increasing traction in the Manosphere and in the sexual marketplace and among more thoughtful individuals that are trying to understand what's happening in the sexual marketplace in general. And that is that there is this sex cycle. About 100 years ago, there was a fairly interesting book published by a man named J.D. Unwin. It's called Sex and Culture. And it is a fairly comprehensive, though not exhaustive, study of some 80 different societies and about 16 civilizations dating back to the Sumerians all the way to the British Empire in the 1930s. And what Unwin found was rather interesting. Basically, that the rise and fall of civilizations hinged upon the sexual liberation of women. Now, when I go to various cities around the world, what I notice is two things in particular. One is that the men that I encounter tend to be more feminine. They tend to be feminized, prissy, passive-aggressive, you might say very refined or foppish in some sense, especially in metropolitan areas. At the same time, there is a dearth of men. In other words, there are far more women than there are men. And this is a factor or trend that I pointed out in a video I made earlier in the summer. Well, what is at core driving this issue? What's driving this tremendous imbalance? Well, J.D. Unwin argued that it's effectively the liberalization of female sexuality. Now, at the same time, there was a fairly recent review of J.D. Unwin's book that I'm going to use as the backdrop for this video. And I think it does an excellent job, not just of distilling J.D. Unwin's argument down into very digestible bites, but also framing it within the context of the sexual revolution that began in the 1960s. Now, no doubt the 1960s is the fulcrum point in many respects around which so many things, at least in the West, have shifted. That being said, this article in particular looks at the sexual revolution moving to the present through the prism of J.D. Unwin's sex cycle. So what exactly did Unwin say? Well, he said a couple things. He said that the cultural condition of any society in any geographical environment is conditioned by its past and present methods of regulating the relations between the sexes. Interesting comment. What Unwin effectively concluded is that any restraints on sexual activity, structural restraints, led to sexual energy sublimation into social energy. That provokes a number of questions. One is, well, what exactly is social energy? What does that mean? Well, he divides this energy into a couple different categories. And I'm going to show this on the screen. According to Arctotherium and their essay on Substack, which I'll link to below, Unwin divides the social display of energy into two categories, expansive and productive. Common examples of expansive social energy are territorial expansion, conquest, colonization, and the foundation of a widely flung commerce. While a society manifesting productive social energy, and this is what we're going to key in on for this video, develops the resources of its habitat and by increasing its knowledge of the material universe, bends nature to its will. Expansive social energy is more common than productive. All societies that display productive social energy first went through a period of expansion, but not all expansive societies become productive. And so most of his work focused on 80 some odd societies. They may have been expansive, maybe they weren't, but only 16 of this group that he studied, he concluded were productive, okay? So from Unwin's perspective, productive energy is more or less, as he puts it, power of reason, the power of creation, and the power of reflecting upon itself being scaled, right? Or being implemented by a society at large. That's the cultural process. So there's a fine line between productive social energy and expansive social energy. And it is the productive social energy that really takes a hit, according to his model, based on the sexual emancipation of women. Okay, so what are the cornerstones of that sexual emancipation? What, in fact, is this continuum that occurs? Well, here we have four basic terms. One is absolute monogamy. The second is modified monogamy. The third is modified polygamy. And the fourth is absolute polygamy. Now, according to Arctotherium's article, I'm going to define these terms so that we're clear. Modified monogamy is the practice or circumstance of having one spouse at one time, the association of being terminable by either party in accordance with the prevailing law or custom. Modified polygamy is the practice or circumstance of having more than one wife at one time, the wives being free to leave their husbands on terms laid down by law and custom. Absolute monogamy being the practice or circumstance of having one spouse at one time, but presupposing conditions whereby legally the wife is under the dominion of her husband and must confine her sexual qualities to him under pain of punishment for the whole of his life or her life. And then finally, absolute polygamy, the practice or circumstance of having more than one wife at one time, these wives being compelled to confine their sexual qualities to their husband for the whole of their lives. Okay, so these four boilerplates, these four metrics, if you will, or categories, seem to form a kind of continuum. And productive societies, and remember that this is always in flux, tend to concentrate more towards the absolute monogamy side. And then over time, as liberalization occurs, it moves increasingly towards absolute polygamy. So how does Arctotherium summarize this? Well, this is what they say. Absolute monogamy is an extraordinarily rigorous institution and has only ever been established via the complete subjugation of women to their husbands. That is, their relegation to the status of a legal non-entity, interacting with society only as an element of their father or husband's household. Furthermore, the process by which absolute monogamy is first modified, then abolished, is the same in every society, reoccurring again and again with unrelieved monotony. And I'll come back to that point towards the end of the video. First, women are emancipated from their husbands and granted co-equal status. Then, marriage is altered from a lifelong commitment to a temporary union made and broken by mutual consent, transitioning from absolute to modified monogamy. In most cases, societies cease to demand prenuptial chastity. After 3 generations, societies cease to display energy, becoming inert and are often conquered by more energetic neighbors. Okay, so in a sense, the sex cycle is precisely as laid out by Arctotherium. You start somewhere around absolute monogamy, and then eventually you decline until you hit absolute polygamy, and that means that your productive energy is capped and then diminished. So, is there evidence since the sexual liberation or since the sexual revolution in the 1960s that we have experienced this, you might say, episodic decline economically, culturally, in the sexual marketplace, so forth and so on? Well, let's consider a few things. The first is marital rates. So marital rates from the 1960s, really in the last 30 years in particular, have declined, and they've declined precipitously, as you can see in the graphic above. At the same time, the numbers of women's sexual partners has steadily risen. And that's a consistent theme that appears to be accelerating, especially in the last 10 to 20 years. So there is that proxy, again, another indicator that sexual liberation has really taken root over the last few decades. Then we can consider the median age of first marriage. So historically, traditionally, that age tends to be between 16 and 25. Well, today it's inching towards 30 and maybe even 35, depending on which Western country you're talking about. So in other words, women are settling down later and later, and the numbers of women that are having children is declining and declining pretty starkly. And that brings us to perhaps the culmination of all of those various metrics, and that is fertility rates. Fertility rates, as you can see in the graphic above, are falling, not just in the West, but globally. So you might think of this sexual emancipation as starting in the Western world, but it definitely appears to be going viral globally. All right, what about the economy? What about productivity, at least in the sense that we understand it today? Well, since the 1970s, there's a number of indicators that suggest that has been slowing down as well. In fact, it has been referred to as the Great Stagnation. Average wages per capita have more or less flattened since the 1980s. And as you can see in the graph above, we are simply not as productive over the last 30, 40, or 50 years as we were before. So again, that comports with this overarching sex cycle model. To compound these effects, you have this disequilibrium in the sexual marketplace. And perhaps this is the least talked about in the mainstream, but it's the most acute or chronic condition that men in particular feel today. And you might say to a lesser extent consciously, but certainly in terms of happiness, women are feeling these effects too. And that is that there is a tremendous attitudinal shift of females towards men. There was a recent article in the New York Post suggesting that as many as a third of women in Western Europe and the United States in particular no longer favor marriage. In other words, they're just looking for various sexual partners or some kind of a relationship that's not defined as a traditional relationship as marriage, okay? So that shift is profound, and obviously that can have a cascading effect in terms of fertility, but also in terms of pair bonding, right? So in other words, there's an increasing number of women that are simply rejecting the traditional mores of marriage and concentrating their interests on a shrinking pool of men at the top. Well, as the sexual liberation of women or sexual choice of women increases, what are their choices? Now, this is where things become particularly interesting. Societies where women exhibit a high degree of sexual choice select for attractiveness to women. And here I'm quoting Arctotherium again. A suite of traits which includes, among other things, muscularity, impulsivity, propensity for interpersonal violence, and sociopathy. So what, in effect, does that mean? Well, as I put it in my piece on the same subject, women largely either choose badly, that is, dark triads, casual hookups, absentee fathers, etc., or pine for a narrow sliver of alphas atop the sexual marketplace who pump and dump them. Now, those are the traits, it seems, that women are validating, especially in online dating. So this takes us to this 80-20 balance, or this 90-10 balance, in which you have a glut of females that are targeting a shrinking sliver of men at the top of the sexual marketplace as they define it. In other words, their sexual choice is what's creating this inverse pyramid and rejecting, you might say, the majority of men. Well, that has, needless to say, created a feedback loop. So men are the recipients of this imbalance, and that has caused what I've talked about on this channel before, this revolt of sexless men, or these dating dropouts that are increasingly divesting, not just from the sexual marketplace, but they're divesting from college and universities, they're falling out of the labor force, they're not participating in society. And of course, if they don't participate, that means society, by definition, is not nearly as productive. Okay, so is this sex cycle, which as far as we can tell, appears to be accurate and has certainly infected the Western mind, if not the global sexual marketplace or the global economy, is that sex cycle unbreakable? Is it fait accompli that the West is in interminable decline? Well, I don't think that's the case. And part of the reason I don't think so is because of something that a professor, Carol Quigley, professor from Georgetown University, said that the West, one of its characteristics is its ability to reform itself again and again. In other words, to some degree, the West might be best positioned to break the sex cycle because of our reformist or our propensity to reform ourselves again and again throughout time. So the question is, can we do that again this time? Is there enough civilizational vigor to do so? Well, I think that depends on the neo-masculine movement. It's also compounded by other variables. It's compounded by, you might say, racial or cultural conflict emerging in the West. It's manifesting itself in the decline of our institutions, or political or socioeconomic instability. All of this suggests that the West is in dire straits, but potentially that could open the door for reformation or for revolutionary change. And I think that is going to happen. However, the neo-masculine movement, this revolt of sexless men, or this divestment from society, these burgeoning movements on the internet, whether it's the Manosphere, or it's the red pill community, or it's the cryptosphere, or it is the alternative media complex. All of these areas of festering frustration form a dangerous continuum. And that is to say that men are going through this very traumatic red pilling experience. Yes, they're growing in consciousness, but there is a malaise, there is a despair, there is a black pilling in which men are divesting. They're not just resisting or revolting against the status quo, but they're self-destructing. The question is, can that self-destructive impulse, this anger and justified frustration, can that be converted? Can it be transformed into reformism? I think it can, but that's going to require a neo-masculine movement that coalesces, or rather assembles all of these various disparate groups under the banner of reformation. Now that brings us to a question: what does reformation look like? Well, I'm not going to address that fully in this episode or in this video, but I will say that reformation must consist of a cultural reformation, a political reformation, a socioeconomic reformation that resets the imbalance of the genders such that it's stable again. That means we're going to have to, in some way, shape, or form, reform divorce laws. That means that we're going to have to reform our welfare states. That means that we're going to have root and branch political reform and some restoration of a spiritual or Christian order, you might say, in the Christian West. That brings me to a final point. J.D. Unwin, despite this fairly comprehensive study that appears to be reliable, even in the modern age, even on the heels of the sexual revolution since the 1960s, it appears to be a fairly consistent and unbreakable cycle. Even Unwin believed, and I'm going to quote him here, that a society that wishes to maintain a high level of culture going forward indefinitely must find a way to emancipate women without compromising on the institution of absolute monogamy. In other words, we're not going to go backwards. We're not going to experience a kind of sexual retrenchment per se. we're going to have to accommodate some of the changes that have occurred. In other words, we're going to have to somehow fuse these two things together. Can that be done? Well, I think it can, but that is a subject that we'll delve into in future videos. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.